There comes a moment in every life when the masks we wear become too heavy to bear. For some, that moment arrives in youth, but for twin sisters Aelwyn and Brida, it came after 30 years of hiding in the shadows of their medieval village. Once beloved healers, they now live as outcasts, branded as witches by the very people they once served. When violent marauders attack their cottage, death seems certain until an unlikely savior appears, a vampire whose ancient eyes hold centuries of pain. He saves them, but his presence awakens something the sisters thought they'd buried forever: the desire to be truly seen. As they tend to his wounds in the flickering candlelight, they find the courage to ask a question that will change everything. What happens when two women who've spent decades protecting their hearts finally dare to reveal their deepest truth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Thornwick like a shroud, weaving between ancient oak trees whose gnarled branches had witnessed centuries of human folly and triumph. In the distance, the village bells chimed the hour of prime, calling the faithful to morning prayers, but their bronze voices carried no comfort to the cottage nestled deep within the moorland's embrace. Here, where wild thyme and foxglove grew in careful abundance, lived two women who had learned that faith was a luxury they could no longer afford. Aelwyn knelt beside her herb garden, her weathered hands gentle as she tended the chamomile plants that would become tonight's tea. At 57, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that every action must serve a purpose, every moment must be weighed against survival. Her silver-streaked hair was bound in a practical braid, and her dark wool dress bore the patches and careful mending of 3 decades spent making do with less. Yet there was something in her bearing, a dignity that no amount of hardship could diminish, a quiet strength that spoke of a woman who had faced the world's cruelty and chosen to remain gentle despite it all. "The calendula is coming along beautifully this year," she murmured to her sister, who sat nearby, grinding dried elderberries into powder. The stone mortar and pestle had belonged to their grandmother, passed down through generations of wise women who had served their communities with healing hands and generous hearts. Now it served 2 exiles who dared not speak their names in the village square. Brida looked up from her work, a smile creasing the corners of her eyes. Though she shared Aelwyn's features, the same high cheekbones, the same thoughtful brown eyes, there was something more openly curious about her expression, a warmth that had survived where others might have grown cold. "Grandmother always said calendula thrives under a gentle hand," she replied, her voice carrying the soft burr of their northern county. "Perhaps it knows it's safe here." Safe, the word hung between them like a prayer half-spoken. This cottage, with its low-beamed ceiling and walls of honey-coloured stone, had been their sanctuary for 30 years. They had built this life together from nothing more than their shared knowledge of healing arts and an unbreakable bond forged in childhood. Every herb that grew in their garden had been planted with intention, every room arranged to serve their quiet existence. The kitchen held shelves lined with glass jars filled with tinctures and dried plants, each labelled in Aelwyn's careful script. The front room contained their simple furniture, 2 chairs by the hearth, a table for meals and work, shelves holding their few precious books. It had not always been this way. Once, these same hands had been welcomed in every home in Thornwick. The sisters had learned their craft from their grandmother, who had learned it from hers, in an unbroken line, stretching back to women whose names were lost to time, but whose wisdom lived on in every carefully prepared remedy. They had delivered babies, set broken bones, eased the passage of the dying. Their cottage had been filled with visitors seeking cures for ailments both physical and spiritual. Aelwyn remembered those days with a mixture of longing and regret. She could still recall the face of young Mary Blackwood, who had come to them with consumption in her lungs, and how they had nursed her back to health with careful doses of coltsfoot and endless patience. She remembered old Thomas the miller, whose arthritic hands they had soothed with willow bark tea until he could work his trade again. They had been valued then, cherished as the guardians of ancient knowledge that could ease suffering and save lives. But knowledge, they had learned, was a double-edged gift. When the harvest failed 3 years running, when children began to sicken with a fever that their remedies could not touch, when fear settled over Thornwick like a blight, the same people who had once blessed their names began to whisper darker words. Witch, sorceress, servants of the devil. It mattered not that they prayed each morning and evening, that they gave freely of their knowledge and asked nothing but simple gratitude in return. Fear, once planted, grew like a poisonous weed in the human heart. The accusations had started slowly. A merchant claimed their love philtre had cursed his marriage when his wife ran off with a travelling tinker. A farmer insisted their fertility charm had hexed his land when his crops withered in drought. Each failure that could not be explained became their fault, each misfortune another mark against their names. The village priest, a nervous man more concerned with his own advancement than the spiritual welfare of his flock, had done nothing to defend them when the whispers grew to shouts. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had stayed?" Brida asked suddenly, her grinding forgotten. It was a question that haunted both of them, particularly on mornings like this, when the mist seemed to carry voices from their past. Aelwyn's hands stilled among the herbs. She had wondered, many times, what their lives might have been if they had remained to face the accusations. Would they have been driven out with stones and curses? Would they have met a worse fate, the kind that befell women accused of trafficking with dark forces? Or might their gentle persistence have eventually won back the trust they had lost? "I think," she said carefully, "we would not have lived to see our 50th year." It was a truth they both recognized, but rarely spoke aloud. Their exile had been voluntary only in the sense that they had chosen it over certain death. They had left Thornwick in the dark of night, taking only what they could carry and the precious knowledge that lived in their minds and hearts. They had found this cottage abandoned and forgotten, its previous owner long dead and no heirs to claim it. Here they had built a new life from the ashes of the old. The isolation had not been easy. There were days when the silence seemed to press against them like a physical weight, when the longing for human company became almost unbearable. They had each other, and for that they were grateful beyond measure, but there were hungers that sisterly affection could not satisfy. They had been young women once, with dreams of love and children and a place in the great tapestry of human connection. Those dreams had been set aside, carefully folded away like wedding gowns that would never be worn. "Sometimes I think about what Mother used to say," Brida continued, her voice soft with memory, "about how every woman deserves to be loved completely, to be known and cherished for exactly who she is. Their mother had been a romantic, full of stories about great loves that transcended time and circumstance. She had died when they were barely 20, taken by the same fever that would later claim so many others, but her words had remained with them. Even now, Aelwyn could hear her voice speaking of souls that recognized each other across impossible distances, of love that saw past surface appearances to the truth beneath. "Mother also said that love requires courage," Aelwyn replied gently. "The courage to be seen, truly seen, by another person." It was perhaps the cruelest irony of their situation that two women who had spent their lives helping others had been denied the very connections they facilitated. They had delivered babies but would never hold their own children. They had counseled young brides but would never know a husband's love. They had eased the grief of widows but would face their own endings alone, save for each other. The cottage held memories of their solitary years like pressed flowers between the pages of a book. Here was the corner where Aelwyn sat on winter evenings, mending clothes by candlelight, while Brida read aloud from their few volumes of poetry. There was the window where they watched the seasons change, marking time by the migration of birds and the turning of leaves. In the garden were the graves of the animals they had tended, a fox with a broken leg, a raven with a damaged wing, creatures that had found sanctuary here as they themselves had done. They had made peace with their chosen exile, finding purpose in small acts of creation and preservation. Their garden flourished under their care, providing not only for their own needs, but for the wild creatures that had learned to trust their gentle presence. They dried herbs against the coming winter, prepared tinctures that might never be used, maintained their knowledge for its own sake rather than for any earthly reward. Yet, underneath the peace they had cultivated, something restless stirred. It was strongest in the long summer evenings, when the light lingered past sunset, or in the early spring when the world seemed to pulse with new life. At these times, they felt the weight of choices unmade, of paths not taken. They were still women, with hearts that yearned for connection and spirits that longed to be fully known by another soul. "Do you think it's too late?" Brida asked, and Aelwyn knew without explanation what she meant. For what? For love? For a different life? For being brave enough to want those things again? Aelwyn considered the question as she returned to her work among the herbs. Around them, bees hummed in lazy contentment, gathering nectar from the lavender and rosemary that thrived in their careful garden. Birds called from the trees that sheltered their cottage, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the gentle lowing of cattle in the village fields. It was a peaceful scene, one that spoke of safety and solitude, but perhaps, she thought, peace was not the same thing as fulfillment. Perhaps there was something to be said for the courage their mother had spoken of, the willingness to risk the comfortable certainty of their present life for the possibility of something more. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think Mother would have said that it's never too late to choose courage over safety." The morning grew warmer as they worked, and gradually the mist began to lift from the hills, revealing the world in all its quiet beauty. They would spend this day, as they had spent so many others, tending their garden, preparing their remedies, finding small satisfactions in work well done. But something had shifted in the speaking of their deepest thoughts, some recognition that their story might not yet be finished. In the distance, smoke rose from the chimneys of Thornwick, carrying the dreams and sorrows of people they had once known and served. The sisters could not return to that world, but perhaps, if they found the courage, they might yet discover what lay beyond the safe boundaries they had drawn around their lives. As the sun climbed higher, chasing away the last wisps of morning mist, Aelwyn and Brida worked on in comfortable silence, their hands busy with the eternal task of nurturing life. They did not yet know that this day would be different from all the others, that by evening their careful world would be forever changed. They knew only that they were together, that their garden flourished, and that somewhere in their hearts, despite all they had endured, hope still grew like a stubborn wildflower in untended ground. The herbs rustled softly in the gentle breeze, and the sisters continued their work, unaware that destiny was already stirring in the shadows beyond their peaceful sanctuary. The first sign of trouble came with the ravens. Aelwyn noticed them at vespers, when the evening light slanted golden through the cottage windows. A murder of the blackbirds had settled in the oak tree nearest their home, their harsh voices cutting through the peaceful twilight like warnings from another world. She paused in her preparation of the evening meal, her hands stilling on the wooden spoon as she counted their dark shapes against the darkening sky. "Brida," she called softly, her voice carrying the kind of careful calm that spoke of years spent managing fear. "Come see this." Her sister appeared from the herb room, wiping her hands on her apron, elderberry stains marking her fingers purple. She followed Aelwyn's gaze and felt the same chill that had touched her sister's heart. Ravens were creatures of wisdom and prophecy in the old stories, but gathered in such numbers, they spoke of change coming and not always the gentle kind. "How many do you count?" Brida asked. "Too many," Aelwyn replied. "And they're all facing south, toward the village, toward the road that wound through the moors and connected their sanctuary to the world they had left behind." The sisters stood at their window, watching the dark assembly, and felt the first stirrings of the unease that would soon consume their peaceful evening. The ravens departed as suddenly as they had arrived, taking wing as one and disappearing into the gathering dusk. But their message lingered in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Something was coming. Something that would test the careful barriers they had built around their hidden life. They tried to return to their normal routine. Brida finished grinding the elderberries, while Aelwyn prepared their simple supper of bread and cheese, with honey from their own hives and mint tea brewed from leaves they had dried themselves. They spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the progress of their garden, plans for preserving the autumn harvest, but underneath their words ran a current of tension neither wished to name. It was full dark when they heard the first sounds. The hoofbeats came from the south, just as the ravens had predicted, pounding against the earth with the urgency of men who rode with purpose. Aelwyn and Brida froze in their chairs by the hearth, their evening tea growing cold in their hands as they listened to the approaching riders. In 30 years of exile, no one had come to their cottage after sunset. No one came to their cottage at all, save for the occasional lost traveller who stumbled upon their path by accident. "Blow out the candles," Aelwyn whispered. Brida moved quickly, extinguishing the flames that marked their presence. The cottage fell into darkness, lit only by the fading glow of the fire in the hearth. They sat in silence, hearts hammering, as the hoofbeats grew closer and finally stopped just beyond their garden gate. Male voices, rough with drink and violence, carried through the night air. "This is the place, ain't it? The witch cottage old Henrik told us about." "Must be. Look at all them herbs growing wild. Unnatural, if you ask me. They say the hags got gold hidden here, old gold from their devil worship." Aelwyn felt her sister's hand find hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining with the desperate strength of women who had faced accusations before and knew how such nights ended. These were not villagers come to demand healing or explanation. These were marauders, the kind of men who rode the wild roads between towns, taking what they wanted and leaving destruction in their wake. "Maybe they ain't home," another voice suggested, but it carried little hope. "Light in the windows still warm," came the response. "They're here, all right, probably cowering like the devil's whores they are." The sisters heard the scrape of steel being drawn, the jingle of leather and mail that spoke of men prepared for violence. These were not farmers driven by superstition or priests armed with holy water. These were killers, and they had come for blood as much as gold. "What do we do?" Brida breathed, her voice barely audible. Aelwyn's mind raced through their limited options. The cottage had only one door, and the windows were too small to climb through quickly. They had no weapons save their herb knives, no defense against armed men save their wit and whatever courage they could muster. In the darkness, she reached for the poker beside the hearth. Poor protection against swords, but better than facing death empty-handed. "We try to reason with them," she whispered back, though her heart held little faith in such a plan. The first blow against their door shattered the evening quiet like thunder. The heavy oak held, but Aelwyn could hear the wood splintering under the assault. Another blow followed, and another, each impact driving splinters across their floor and terror deeper into their hearts. "Open up, witches!" The voice was slurred with ale but sharp with menace. "We know you're in there!" The door buckled on the fourth blow, hanging askew on its iron hinges. Through the gap, torchlight flickered, red and angry, revealing glimpses of bearded faces twisted with greed and malice. Aelwyn pulled her sister behind her, the poker raised in her trembling hand, as the first of the marauders kicked his way into their sanctuary. He was a large man, thick-bodied and scarred, with the look of someone who had made his living from other people's fear. Behind him came three others, all armed, all drunk on the anticipation of easy prey. Their eyes swept the cottage's simple interior, taking in the herbs hanging from the rafters, the books on their shelves, the modest furniture that spoke of women who lived quietly and bothered no one. "Well, well," the leader said, his voice carrying false gentleness that made Aelwyn's skin crawl. "The witch sisters, just like old Henrik promised, and prettier than expected, even at their age." "We have done nothing wrong," Aelwyn said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "We live peacefully here, harming no one." "Peaceful?" One of the other men laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "That's not what we heard. We heard you curse crops and steal babies and dance naked under the full moon." "We are healers," Brida said, stepping beside her sister despite Aelwyn's protective gesture. "We help people. We always have. Help people straight to hell, more like," the leader spat. "But we ain't here for preaching. We want the gold you've been hoarding. The devil's payment for your dark services." "We have no gold," Aelwyn replied truthfully. "We live simply, growing our own food, making our own clothes. What little we have, you can see for yourself." The man's expression darkened at her words, and his hand tightened on his sword hilt. "Don't lie to me, witch. Everyone knows your kind hoards treasure. Now, where is it?" When the sisters remained silent, he gestured to his men. They began ransacking the cottage with systematic violence, overturning furniture, smashing clay pots, tearing books from shelves. 30 years of careful accumulation destroyed in moments, a lifetime of simple treasures reduced to scattered debris. "Please," Brida whispered, watching one of the men grind her precious elderberry powder under his boot. "Please stop. Tell us where the gold is," the leader demanded, "or we'll tear this place apart board by board." "We have told you the truth," Aelwyn said, her voice growing stronger as anger began to overcome fear. "We have no gold. We have nothing but what you see." The man backhanded her across the face, the blow sending her stumbling against the wall. Stars exploded across her vision as pain bloomed along her cheek, but she held her ground, the poker still gripped in her hand. "Search them," the leader ordered his men. "Maybe they're carrying it." Rough hands reached for the sisters, and Aelwyn swung the poker with desperate strength, catching one of the men across his reaching arm. He howled and stumbled back, clutching his injury, but the others pressed forward with renewed violence. It was then that the temperature in the cottage dropped like a stone. The marauders' torches flickered and dimmed, casting dancing shadows on the walls as their flames struggled against some unseen force. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against them with the weight of approaching storm. And from the darkness beyond the broken door came a sound that froze every heart in the room, a low growl that spoke of predators and ancient hunger. "What in hell?" one of the men began, but his words were cut off as a figure materialized in the doorway. He stood silhouetted against the night, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of someone for whom violence was as natural as breathing. The torchlight caught glimpses of dark hair, pale skin, and eyes that reflected the flames like a wolf's. When he smiled, the sisters saw teeth that were too sharp, too white, designed for purposes that had nothing to do with human food. "Gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried the cultured accent of nobility alongside. "Something far more dangerous. I believe you are trespassing." The marauders turned to face this new threat, swords raised, but their leader's voice shook as he spoke. "This ain't your concern, stranger. Move along." The vampire, for there was no mistaking what he was, stepped into the cottage proper, his movements liquid and predatory. "Actually," he said conversationally, "it very much is my concern. These ladies are under my protection." In the firelight, Aelwyn could see him clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 40 in appearance, though something in his bearing suggested centuries rather than decades. His face was aristocratic, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw marked by old scars. His clothes spoke of quality fine wool and leather that had known better days but still carried the ghost of former elegance. At his side hung a sword that looked both ancient and deadly. "Your protection?" the marauder leader stammered. "Indeed." The vampire's smile widened, showing more of those predatory teeth. "And I take my responsibilities quite seriously." What followed was less a fight than an execution. The vampire moved with inhuman speed and strength, his sword singing through the air with lethal precision. The marauders, for all their bluster and brutality, were merely human. They fell like wheat before the scythe, their screams brief and their blood flowing dark across the cottage floor. When it was finished, the vampire stood among the bodies, cleaning his blade with methodical care. His pale eyes found the sisters, who had pressed themselves against the far wall during the brief, savage confrontation. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentling as he addressed them. Aelwyn touched her bruised cheek, still clutching the poker in her other hand. We are alive," she managed. "Good." He sheathed his sword and turned to survey the damage the marauders had done to their home. "I apologize for the mess, and for arriving so late. I should have been watching more carefully." "Watching?" Brida whispered. The vampire's eyes met hers, and she saw something unexpected in their depths, loneliness as deep and old as winter. "I have been aware of you both for some time," he admitted. "Two wise women living peacefully in the wild places. It seemed a tragedy that such knowledge and gentleness should go unprotected." As if the violence had drained his strength, the vampire swayed on his feet. In the torchlight, Aelwyn could see dark stains spreading across his fine clothes, blood, but not from his victims. "You're wounded," she said, her healer's instincts overcoming her fear. "It will heal," he replied, but his voice had grown weaker. "Not if you don't let us help," Brida said, stepping forward despite the carnage around them. "We are healers. It's what we do." The vampire looked at them for a long moment, weighing trust against vulnerability. Finally, he nodded. "My name is Aldrich," he said as he allowed them to guide him to one of their few unbroken chairs. "And I believe, ladies, that this night has changed everything for all of us." The vampire's blood was unlike anything the sisters had encountered in their decades of healing work. It flowed dark as midnight wine, refusing to clot despite the severity of his wounds, and where it touched their hands, they felt a strange tingling that spoke of power far beyond mortal understanding. Aldrich had removed his torn shirt without ceremony, revealing a torso marked by centuries of violence, scars layered upon scars like pages in a book of endless conflict. The fresh wounds, inflicted by the marauder's crude blades, wept crimson against the pale landscape of his skin. "The bleeding won't stop naturally," he explained, as Aelwyn pressed clean linen against a particularly deep gash across his ribs. His voice remained steady despite the pain, carrying the kind of resigned patience that came from enduring countless such injuries over an impossibly long existence. "My body heals, but slowly, and not without help." Brida moved with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies from their herb stores despite the chaos the attackers had wrought. Glass vials lay shattered across the floor, their precious contents seeping into the wooden planks, but enough remained intact for her to work with. She selected yarrow for its clotting properties, comfrey root to promote healing, and willow bark to ease pain, the same remedies their grandmother had taught them, though she wondered if such mortal medicine could aid an immortal body. "What are you?" Aelwyn asked quietly as she cleaned the wounds with water from their kettle. The question hung between them like smoke, heavy with implications neither sister was certain they wanted to understand. "Old," Aldrich replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Older than the village below, older than the stones of its church. I have walked this earth for 6 centuries, and in all that time I have rarely, encountered kindness offered so freely to a stranger. 6 centuries. The words settled over them like a shroud, impossible to fully comprehend. While their ancestors had lived and died, loved and lost, struggled and triumphed through generation upon generation, this being had endured. Aelwyn tried to imagine such a span of existence and found her mind reeling from the vastness of it. "Are you?" Brida began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice the question that burned in her throat. "A vampire? A creature of the night? A drinker of blood?" Aldrich's mouth curved in a smile that held more sadness than humor. "All of those things, yes, but also, in this moment, simply a man grateful for gentle hands and healing hearts." They worked in silence for a time, the sisters applying their knowledge with the same care they had once shown to mortal patients. The herbs seemed to take effect, despite Aldrich's supernatural nature, the bleeding gradually slowing as their remedies worked there. Ancient magic. But there was something more at play here. Aelwyn could feel it in the way her hands warmed as she touched his skin, in the way the shadows in the cottage seemed to dance with life beyond the flickering firelight. "How long have you been watching us?" Brida asked, as she prepared a poultice to draw out any corruption from the wounds. "Nearly a year," Aldrich admitted. "I discovered this place by accident, following rumors of wise women who lived beyond the reach of village suspicion. I was curious about mortals who chose solitude over society, who found purpose in healing rather than harming." Aelwyn's hands stilled in their work. "You've been spying on us?" "Observing," he corrected gently. "Ensuring your safety from a distance. These hills attract dangerous men, bandits, deserters, those who prey upon the isolated and defenseless. I have turned away more than a few who might have brought you harm." The revelation sent a chill through both sisters. For a year, while they had lived their quiet existence, believing themselves alone and unnoticed, this creature of legend had been their unseen guardian. It raised questions about the nature of their solitude, the reality of their safety, and the motivations of a being who claimed to protect strangers without seeking reward. Why? The question came from both sisters simultaneously, spoken with the eerie synchronization that sometimes marked their shared thoughts. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes focused on something beyond the cottage walls. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of loneliness. "Because in watching you, I remembered what it meant to care for something beyond my own survival. Because your gentleness with wounded creatures, your dedication to preservation and healing, reminded me of virtues I thought I had lost long ago." As Brida secured the bandages around his torso, her fingers brushed against old scars that told stories of battles fought in ages past. Some were thin and precise, speaking of duels with skilled opponents. Others were ragged and brutal, evidence of conflicts that had been matters of survival rather than honor. Each mark was a chapter in the long book of his existence, a testament to violence endured and inflicted. "These are very old," she observed, tracing one particularly intricate scar that spiraled around his shoulder like ivy. "From the siege of Orleans," he replied. "I was fighting for the French then, though I no longer remember why such mortal conflict seemed important. Orleans." Aelwyn knew enough history to place that battle in the previous century, during the great wars that had shaped the continental kingdoms. To speak of it as personal memory rather than historical fact was to confront again the vast scope of his existence. "Do you remember all of it?" she asked. 6 centuries of life? Some things fade," Aldrich admitted. "Faces blur together, names become whispers, entire decades compress into impressions of pain or beauty or loss. But certain moments remain sharp as broken glass. The night I was changed, the first time I took a life to sustain my own, the faces of those I failed to protect." There was such weariness in his voice that Aelwyn found herself reaching out to touch his hand, an instinctive gesture of comfort that she only realized after her fingers had made contact. with his cold skin. He looked down at their joined hands with something approaching wonder, as if kindness was a sensation he had nearly forgotten. "You speak of protection," Brida said as she organized the remaining herbs. "But who protects you?" The question seemed to surprise him. "I am not easily harmed. That's not what I meant." She looked up from her work, meeting his ancient eyes with her own mortal ones. "Who cares for your wounds? Who tends to your loneliness? Who offers you comfort when the weight of so many years becomes too much to bear?" For the first time since his arrival, Aldrich appeared genuinely at a loss for words. He stared at Brida, as if she had spoken in a language he had forgotten how to understand, as if the very concept of someone caring for his well-being was foreign to his experience. "No one," he finally whispered. "There has been no one for a very long time." The cottage fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind in the eaves. Outside, the bodies of the marauders lay cooling in the night air. But inside, something new was being born. A connection that none of them fully understood, but all of them felt stirring in the space between heartbeats. Aelwyn found herself studying this creature who had saved them, this being who spoke of centuries as if they were seasons, who carried scars from battles fought before her grandparents were born. There was something profoundly lonely about him, a solitude that made their own 30 years of exile seem brief by comparison. "You're welcome to stay," she heard herself say, "until your wounds heal properly." Aldrich's eyes met hers, and she saw surprise flicker in their pale depths. "You would trust a monster in your home?" "You're not a monster," Brida said firmly. "Monsters don't save strangers. Monsters don't speak with regret about the lives they've taken. Monsters don't carry loneliness like a wound that never heals." In the warm glow of firelight, with gentle hands tending to his injuries and kind words soothing hurts deeper than flesh, Aldrich felt something he had thought lost forever, beginning to stir within his ancient heart. Perhaps for the first time in centuries, he was not alone. The discovery came 3 days later, quite by accident. Aelwyn had been searching for clean linen to change Aldrich's bandages when her hand brushed against the loose stone in the cottage's foundation, the hiding place where they had secreted their most precious possessions during those first fearful years of exile. Her fingers found the familiar shape of the oiled leather pouch, and she drew it out without thinking, muscle memory guiding her movements. It was only when the letters spilled across her lap that she remembered what she had retrieved. 7 pieces of parchment, yellowed with age and soft from countless readings, tied with a ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to the color of winter sky. Letters written in a young man's careful hand, addressed to "My dearest Brida," in ink that had turned brown with the passage of years. Love letters from a courtship that had bloomed and died in the space of one cruel winter, 30 years past. "Oh," she breathed, her heart clenching with remembered pain. Brida looked up from where she sat, grinding fresh herbs, her eyes widening as she recognized what her sister held. "I thought we had burned those." "We meant to," Aelwyn replied softly. "But I couldn't bear to destroy them entirely. They were all we had left of what might have been," Brida finished, her voice carrying the weight of old sorrow. Aldrich, who had been resting in the chair by the window, observed the exchange with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the subtle currents of human emotion. His wounds were healing with supernatural swiftness, but he had remained in the cottage, at the sisters' invitation, sharing their simple meals and quiet conversations as if he were a mortal guest rather than a creature of the night. "Love letters?" he asked gently. Aelwyn nodded, her fingers tracing the faded ribbon. "From a blacksmith's son named Thomas. He was kind and gentle, and he saw something in Brida that others missed. He wrote to her of marriage, of children, of the life they might build together." "What happened to him?" Aldrich's question was carefully neutral, but there was something in his tone that suggested he already guessed the answer. The accusations started, Brida said, her hands stilling in their work. The whispers about witchcraft and dark dealings. Thomas's father forbade the match, said he wouldn't see his son bound to a sorceress. Thomas tried to convince him, tried to defend us, but fear is stronger than love, more often than not, Aldrich observed with the bitter wisdom of long experience. He came to us the night before we left, Aelwyn continued. Brought these letters and begged Brida to run away with him. He said we could start fresh in another village where no one knew our names. Brida's eyes grew distant with memory. I almost said yes. For one moment, I imagined it being Thomas's wife, bearing his children, living the ordinary life I had always dreamed of. But I couldn't leave Aelwyn alone to face whatever might come. We had always been together, always protected each other. How could I abandon her for the promise of love? The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of sacrifice and the ghost of roads not taken. Aldrich studied both women with new understanding, seeing in their story an echo of his own long centuries of choosing duty over desire, survival over connection. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. Brida was silent for a long moment, her brown eyes reflecting the firelight as she considered the question. "I regret that we lived in a world where I had to choose. I regret that fear made cowards of good people. I regret that Thomas spent his life wondering what he had done wrong when the fault was never his." She paused, touching one of the letters with gentle fingers. "But I don't regret staying with Aelwyn. Some bonds are stronger than romance, more enduring than passion. The love between sisters is its own kind of miracle." Aldrich nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a bridge built of shared experience. "I had brothers once," he said, "not by blood, but by choice. Men who fought beside me, who trusted me with their lives as I trusted them with mine. I watched them age and die while I remained unchanged. And I swore I would never again allow myself to care so deeply for mortals, whose lives were but brief candles in the eternal darkness. Yet here you are," Aelwyn observed, "sitting in our cottage, sharing our fire, protecting us from harm." "Yes," he admitted with a rueful smile. "It seems some lessons are harder to learn than others." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before. Perhaps it was the presence of the love letters, tangible proof of dreams deferred and chances lost, or perhaps it was the growing trust that had developed between them during his convalescence. Whatever the cause, they found themselves speaking of deeper things, of loneliness and longing, of the courage it took to remain open to connection despite the certainty of eventual loss. "Tell us about them," Brida said suddenly, "the women you loved in all those centuries." Aldrich's expression grew thoughtful. "There have been few. Vampires are not creatures made for peace. Love we take, rather than give, consume, rather than nurture. But yes, there have been some who touched my heart despite my nature." He spoke of Elena, a Spanish noblewoman during the Wars of Succession, whose beauty had been matched only by her fierce intelligence. She had known what he was, and loved him anyway, until time claimed her and left him holding nothing but memories and regret. He told them of Marie, a French artist who had painted his portrait by moonlight and seen past his immortal facade to the man he had been before the curse claimed him. She had grown old while he remained young, and in the end she had begged him to grant her the dark gift so they might be together forever. He had refused, unable to damn her soul for the sake of his own comfort. "Each loss taught me that love, for my kind, is a form of cruelty," he concluded. "We fall in love with mortals who will wither and die while we endure. We watch beauty fade, watch minds grow dim, watch strong hearts grow, weak and still. Better to remain alone than to inflict such pain on both ourselves and those we claim to care for." "But surely," Aelwyn said carefully, "the joy of loving someone, even briefly, outweighs the sorrow of losing them." Aldrich met her gaze, and she saw centuries of accumulated grief in his pale eyes. "You would think so, wouldn't you? But pain has a way of outlasting pleasure when you have eternity to remember both." The sisters exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke of shared understanding and mutual recognition. Here was a being who had experienced the fullness of love and loss across centuries, while they had known only the shadow of what might have been. Yet in their different ways, all three had chosen solitude over the risk of further heartbreak. "Perhaps," Brida said slowly, "the problem isn't that love ends, but that we're so afraid of endings that we forget to embrace beginnings." The moonstone pendant at her throat caught the firelight as she spoke, the family heirloom that she and Aelwyn had shared since childhood. In its depths, silver light seemed to dance with possibilities unspoken, with courage yet to be found, with hope that refused to die despite all they had endured. The map appeared on the 7th morning of Aldrich's stay, tumbling from his travel pack when Brida accidentally knocked it over while preparing breakfast. The parchment was ancient beyond description, its edges cracked and yellowed like autumn leaves, marked with symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer in the morning light. As it unrolled across their wooden table, the sisters could see it depicted not the familiar geography of their homeland, but something far stranger, a collection of sites marked with arcane symbols, connected by lines that pulsed with faint silver light. "What is this?" Aelwyn asked, her healer's fingers hovering over the mysterious document without quite daring to touch it. Aldrich, who had frozen at the sight of the exposed map, closed his eyes briefly as if summoning courage for a confession he had hoped to avoid. "The reason I cannot stay here forever," he said quietly, "no matter how much I might wish to." Brida studied the symbols scattered across the parchment, some resembling Celtic knots, others bearing the angular lines of runic script, still others seeming to be languages that predated human civilization entirely. At the center of the map, one symbol glowed brighter than the rest, pulsing like a heartbeat in the dawn light. "These are places of power," she said, her grandmother's teaching stirring in her memory. "Sacred sites where the veil between worlds grows thin." "Very good," Aldrich acknowledged with a wan smile. "Your education was more comprehensive than I realized. But why do you need such a map?" Aelwyn pressed. "What are you searching for?" The vampire was quiet for so long that they began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of regret. "I am looking for a way to break a curse, not the one that made me what I am. That choice was mine, made in desperation but still freely chosen. No, this is something else entirely, something I brought upon myself through pride and foolish love." He moved to stand by the window, gazing out at their garden where morning glory vines climbed toward the sun. 600 years ago, I was not merely a vampire, I was a king." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of implications that neither sister could fully grasp. A king. They had been harboring not just an immortal creature, but royalty from an age when such titles carried weight and meaning that modern nobility could barely comprehend. "The plague had come to my lands," Aldrich continued, his voice growing distant with memory. "Not the common sickness that physicians could treat, but something darker, a pestilence that seemed to devour souls as well as bodies. My people were dying by the thousands, and no medicine, no prayer, no sacrifice could turn back the tide of death." Aelwyn felt her breath catch. She had heard stories of such plagues from her grandmother, tales of supernatural diseases that appeared when the balance between worlds was disturbed. "What did you do?" "I sought help from those who trafficked with powers beyond mortal understanding. Witches, yes, but also beings older and darker than any human sorceress. They offered me a bargain, immortal life, and the strength to fight supernatural disease in exchange for my mortal soul and a price to be named later." "You accepted," Brida said softly, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. I accepted, and it worked. After a fashion, I gained the power to heal my people, to drive back the plague through will and magic and the terrible strength that vampirism granted me. For a time, my kingdom flourished as no mortal realm had before or since. But there was a price, Aelwyn guessed. Aldrich's laugh was bitter as winter wind. There is always a price. The beings I had bargained with eventually came to collect, and what they demanded was not gold or service, or even worship. They wanted my kingdom itself, every soul I had saved, every life I had preserved, every child who had been born because the plague had ended. They wanted to claim it all for their own dark purposes. The sisters exchanged horrified glances. To save his people only to deliver them to a worse fate, the cruel irony was almost too terrible to contemplate. I refused, of course, broke my bargain and turned my newfound power against my former allies. The war that followed lasted 7 years and left my kingdom in ruins. But I saved my people's souls, even as I damned my own to wander forever between the living and the dead. The curse, Brida whispered. The curse, he confirmed, never to know rest, never to find peace, never to be fully alive nor properly dead, and bound by magical chains that prevent me from ending my own existence, no matter how much I might wish to. He turned from the window to face them, and they could see the weight of 6 centuries of guilt written in the lines of his face. The map shows places where such curses might be broken if one can find the right ritual, the proper sacrifice, the correct alignment of power and will. Aelwyn's mind raced as she studied the parchment more closely. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see the pattern. Each marked location corresponded to sites mentioned in her grandmother's oldest teachings, places where the earth's power ran deep and strong. "How many of these have you tried?" she asked. "Most of them. Over the centuries, I have sought release at stone circles in the northern wastes, at buried temples in distant lands, at crossroads where 4 kingdoms meet. Each time I have found myself lacking something essential to complete the ritual." "What sort of thing?" Brida asked, though something in her expression suggested she was beginning to suspect the answer. Aldrich's pale eyes met hers, and she saw vulnerability there that cut deeper than any physical wound. A willing heart, someone who would choose to share the burden freely, not from fear or coercion or promise of reward, but from love freely given. The cottage fell silent, except for the gentle crackling of the fire and the distant sound of birds in their garden. The implications of his words hung heavy in the air, not just the magnitude of what he was searching for, but the terrible loneliness that had driven him to seek it. "And you believe such a person exists?" Aelwyn asked gently. "I believed once, but 6 centuries of searching have taught me that love freely given is perhaps the rarest magic in all the world. Rarer than immortality, more precious than any treasure, more elusive than any quest." As if responding to the emotional weight of the moment, the map's symbols pulsed brighter, and the sisters could feel something stirring in the air around them, a presence that spoke of ancient powers awakening, of destinies beginning to converge. Outside, the village bells of Thornwick rang the hour of Terce, calling the faithful to morning prayers. But inside the cottage, 3 souls stood on the threshold of a different kind of awakening, surrounded by maps and mysteries and the growing certainty that their meeting had been anything but chance. The crystals sang when Aelwyn first touched them. She had been organizing what remained of their herb stores, salvaging what the marauders hadn't destroyed, when her fingers brushed against the wooden box hidden beneath their floorboards. The moment her skin made contact with the smooth stones within, a pure, resonant note filled the cottage, not heard but felt, vibrating through bone and sinew like the memory of distant music. "What in heaven's name?" Brida began, but her words died as she saw what her sister had uncovered. 7 crystals lay, nestled in faded velvet, each no larger than a robin's egg, but perfectly formed. They glowed with inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the sisters' heartbeats, shifting from deep blue to silver to gold as the morning sun touched their faceted surfaces. These were no ordinary stones. They hummed with power that spoke of Earth's deepest mysteries, of magic older than human memory. Grandmother's healing crystals. Aelwyn breathed, wonder and fear warring in her voice. I thought they were lost when we fled the village. You saved them, Brida said, moving closer to examine the miraculous stones. All these years, and you never told me. I was afraid, Aelwyn admitted. Afraid of what they represented, of the power they held. We were accused of witchcraft for lesser things. What would the villagers have done if they had known we possessed stones that sang with their own light? Aldrich approached slowly, drawn by the crystal's ethereal music. As he drew near, the stones' glow intensified, their song growing more complex, harmonizing in ways that made the cottage walls themselves seem to resonate with ancient power. Remarkable, he murmured. I've encountered such stones only twice in 6 centuries. They are said to amplify natural gifts, to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal realms. Grandmother used them to enhance her healing, Brida explained, reaching out tentatively to touch one of the smaller crystals. It warmed under her fingers, pulsing like a living thing. She said they could draw sickness from the body, mend wounds that should have been mortal, even ease the passing of souls who were ready to move beyond this world. But they respond to you differently now, Aldrich observed, studying the way the crystal's light danced across their faces. Your gifts have grown stronger during your years of exile, deepened by solitude and refined by necessity. As if to prove his words, the crystal in Brida's hand began to emit rays of healing light that wrapped around her fingers like living silk. Where the light touched, small cuts and burns from their recent travails disappeared entirely, leaving her skin smooth and unmarked. It's responding to your presence, Aelwyn realized, looking at Aldrich with new understanding. The stones have never sung so clearly before. Something about your nature is awakening their full power. Indeed. As the vampire moved closer to the crystals, their song grew richer and more complex, harmonies layering upon harmonies until the very air seemed to shimmer with possibility. And something else was happening, something that none of them had expected. The terrible hunger that had haunted Aldrich since his transformation, the constant gnawing need for blood that he had learned to control but never to banish, was growing quiet. Not disappearing entirely, but softening to a whisper instead of its usual roar. "How is this possible?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder as he felt the burden that had tormented him for centuries beginning to lift. "The stones don't just heal the body," Aelwyn said, her healer's intuition guiding her understanding. "They heal the spirit, restore balance where it has been disrupted. Perhaps they can ease the supernatural hunger that drives your kind. Or perhaps," Brida added thoughtfully, "they're responding to something else entirely. The connection that's growing between us, the trust, the care, the affection. Grandmother always said the stones worked best when there was love to guide them." The word hung in the air between them like a bridge half-built, dangerous to cross but impossible to ignore. Love. It was the first time any of them had spoken the word aloud, giving voice to the feelings that had been growing stronger with each shared meal, each quiet conversation, each moment of vulnerability offered and accepted. But their tentative exploration of these deeper emotions was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats on the distant road, not the chaotic thunder of marauders this time, but the measured pace of horses ridden with purpose. Through the cottage window, they could see riders approaching across the moor, their dark robes marking them as clergy. "Church soldiers," Aldrich said grimly, his newfound peace evaporating like morning mist. "Someone has reported the deaths of those men, and they've come to investigate." The sisters felt their hearts sink as they recognized the lead rider, Father Marcus, the priest from the village below. a man whose ambition was matched only by his capacity for cruelty. He had been a young deacon when they fled Thornwick 30 years ago, but even then he had shown a disturbing fascination with hunting down those he deemed heretical or unnatural. "They'll search the cottage," Brida said, quickly moving to conceal the crystals. "If they find you here, if they sense what you are, they'll burn this place to the ground," Aelwyn finished, her face pale with remembered terror. "And us with it." But Aldrich shook his head, moving with sudden purpose toward his travel pack. "Not if I'm gone before they arrive. I won't see you harmed for the sin of offering me sanctuary." "No," Brida said firmly, surprising all of them with the steel in her voice. "We've spent 30 years running from fear, hiding from those who would judge us for gifts we never asked for. I won't see you driven away by the same ignorance that drove us from our home. Besides," Aelwyn added, her own resolve strengthening as she spoke, "you said the curse can only be broken by someone willing to share the burden freely. How can we make such a choice if we don't even have the courage to stand together against mortal threats?" The crystals pulsed brighter at her words, their song growing triumphant, as if the stones themselves approved of their decision. And in that moment, all three of them felt it, the shift in the very fabric of reality around them, the sense that they stood at a crossroads where multiple destinies might be fulfilled or forever lost. "Then we face them together," Aldrich said simply. "But know this, if it comes to violence, if they threaten your lives, I will not restrain the monster within me. Priest or no priest, I will protect what I have come to treasure above my own existence." Outside, the hoofbeats grew closer, and the sisters could hear Father Marcus calling out in his rich, carrying voice words of divine authority mixed with barely concealed threat. The sanctuary they had built was about to be tested, and with it the fragile bond that had grown between three souls who had found in each other something worth fighting for. The crystals continued their ethereal song, weaving harmonies of hope and defiance as they prepared to discover whether love could truly conquer fear, or whether the forces arrayed against them would prove too strong to overcome. Father Marcus dismounted from his horse with the careful precision of a man who understood the weight of ceremony. Behind him, 6 armed soldiers arranged themselves in a defensive formation around the cottage, their hands resting on sword hilts as their eyes swept the building for signs of supernatural corruption. But it was the small wooden box the priest carried that made Aldrich's breath catch in recognition. Through the cottage window, the sisters could see him approaching their door with measured steps, his black robes rustling in the morning breeze. Father Marcus had aged in the 30 years since they had known him. His hair had silvered, and lines of authority marked his face, but his eyes held the same cold certainty that had made him dangerous even as a young deacon. "In the name of the Church, and by the authority granted to me by His Holiness, Father," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of countless sermons, "I command those within to open this door and submit to holy examination." Aldrich's pale hands clenched into 12 fists as he stared at the approaching priest. "That box he carries," he whispered urgently to the sisters. "I know what it contains." "What?" Aelwyn asked, though she could already sense from his expression that the revelation would not be welcome. "A fragment of the crown I once wore. The source of my curse, broken into pieces when my kingdom fell. I thought all the fragments had been lost or destroyed, but how does a village priest come to possess one?" The implications sent ice through Brida's veins. If Father Marcus knew what Aldrich was, if he understood the supernatural forces at play, then this was no random investigation. This was a trap that had been decades in the making. "Open the door," the priest commanded again, "or we shall be forced to break it down in the name of righteousness." With the crystals still humming their ethereal song behind them, Aelwyn made the decision that would change everything. She unlatched the door and stepped into the morning light, her sister beside her, presenting a united front to the men who had come to judge them. "Father Marcus," she said calmly, "you are far from your parish church. What brings you to our humble cottage?" The priest's eyes swept over both sisters with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. "Reports have reached me of dark happenings in these hills. Dead men found drained of blood, supernatural lights seen dancing in your windows, the stench of unholy magic hanging heavy in the air." "We are healers," Brida replied steadily, "as we have always been. If men have died, it was not by our hand." "Indeed?" Father Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Then you won't object to a thorough search of your dwelling. I'm sure you have nothing to hide from the eyes of the righteous." It was then that Aldrich stepped into the doorway behind the sisters, his presence causing an immediate reaction among the soldiers. Hands flew to weapons, horses shied nervously, and the very air seemed to thicken with supernatural tension. But it was Father Marcus's response that revealed the true depth of the trap they had walked into. The priest's face lit with triumph as he opened the wooden box he carried, revealing a piece of ancient gold that caught the morning sun like captured fire. The crown fragment was no larger than a man's palm, but it pulsed with malevolent energy that made the healing crystal's song falter and grow discordant. "Aldrich of Raven Shallow," Father Marcus said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute knowledge. "The cursed king, the undead monarch, the vampire lord who has haunted the chronicles of the church for 6 centuries. Aelwyn felt the world tilt around her as the priest's words sank in. Not just a vampire, a legendary figure from church histories, a creature so notorious that his name was used to frighten novice priests and steal the resolve of holy warriors. "You know nothing of what you speak," Aldrich said, but his voice lacked conviction. The crown fragment's proximity was affecting him, drawing power from his immortal essence and leaving him visibly weakened. "On the contrary," Father Marcus replied smoothly, "I know everything about you. Your kingdom, your bargain with dark powers, your refusal to honor the debt that damned your soul. I know about your quest to break the curse that binds you, and I know about the requirement for a willing heart to share your burden." The priest's gaze shifted to the sisters, and they saw understanding dawn in his cold eyes. "How convenient that you should find not one but 2 hearts ready to sacrifice themselves for love. How perfectly tragic that they are the same wise women who fled Thornwick 30 years ago, accused of witchcraft and trafficking with dark forces." "You orchestrated this," Brida breathed, the pattern becoming clear. The marauders, the attack, Aldrich's timely rescue, none of it was chance. Father Marcus's smile widened. "The church has been tracking the cursed king for decades, waiting for him to attempt another ritual site. When we learned he was approaching this region, it was simple enough to arrange circumstances that would throw him together with 2 lonely women desperate for connection. Who better to provide the willing hearts he needs than exiles who have already been branded as servants of darkness?" The crown fragment pulsed brighter, and with each pulse, Aldrich seemed to grow more solid, more present, but also more trapped. Ancient magic was reasserting itself, the bonds of his original curse tightening around him like invisible chains. "But here's what you don't understand," the priest continued, clearly savoring his moment of triumph. "The ritual that breaks the curse doesn't destroy it, it transfers it. The willing hearts who choose to share your burden will take the full weight of damnation upon themselves, freeing you to become mortal once more, while they become the new guardians of supernatural hunger and eternal imprisonment." The words hit the cottage clearing like a physical blow. Aelwyn and Brida stared at Aldrich in shock, seeing in his agonized expression the confirmation of what they had not been told. The choice to save him would damn them to the very existence he sought to escape. "You didn't know," Aelwyn whispered. "And it was not a question." Aldrich began, but the words died in his throat. The truth was written in every line of his face, in the shame that bent his shoulders, in the tears that gathered in his ancient eyes. I hoped it wouldn't be necessary. I thought perhaps the ritual could be modified, the burden shared rather than transferred. I never meant for either of you to... To what? Brida's voice was sharp as broken glass. To love you? To trust you? To offer everything we are for a lie wrapped in pretty words about redemption? Father Marcus watched their confrontation with obvious satisfaction, the crown fragment in his hands, growing brighter with each moment of discord between them. Such sweet tragedy, he murmured. The monster falls in love with his intended sacrifices, only to discover that love itself is the trap that will destroy them all. But even as the priest spoke, something unexpected happened. The healing crystals in the cottage, responding to the emotional turmoil and the presence of the crown fragment, began to sing louder, their harmonies building to a crescendo that made the very air shimmer with possibility. Unless... Father Marcus continued, his voice taking on a new, more dangerous tone, you choose a different path. Surrender the vampire to church authority. Renounce your healing gifts as products of dark influence, and submit to a lifetime of penance in church service. Your lives will be spared, your souls cleansed, and your names cleared of all suspicion. And Aldrich, Aelwyn asked, though she already knew the answer, will be destroyed as befits a creature of ultimate darkness, the priest replied, without hesitation, burned with holy fire until nothing remains but ash and memory. The choice stood before them like a crossroads in the mist: save themselves by betraying the being they had come to love, or accept damnation for the sake of a relationship built on incomplete truths and hidden costs. The crown fragment pulsed with malevolent satisfaction, the crystals sang with desperate hope, and, in the space between heartbeats, three souls prepared to discover what price they were truly willing to pay for the promise of connection in a world that seemed designed to keep them forever apart. Outside the cottage, Father Marcus and his soldiers waited with the patience of hunters who knew their prey was trapped, while inside, the most important decision in 6 centuries hung in the balance between love and wisdom, sacrifice and survival, truth and the beautiful lies that sometimes made existence bearable. In the silence that followed, Father Marcus's ultimatum, the world seemed to hold its breath. The healing crystals continued their ethereal song, their harmonies now interweaving with the malevolent pulse of the crown fragment in a musical battle between light and shadow. Aelwyn could feel the stones calling to her from within the cottage, their power reaching out like gentle hands offering comfort and strength. But it was the ritual binding stones that drew her attention most powerfully, 3 smooth river rocks that had appeared on their windowsill that very morning, as if placed there by some benevolent force. The stones, she whispered to Brida, her voice barely audible above the supernatural tension crackling through the air. Do you see them? Brida's gaze followed her sister's, and her breath caught as she recognized what lay gleaming in the morning light. 3 stones, each perfectly matched to one of them, dark obsidian for Aldrich's tormented past, clear quartz for Aelwyn's healing gift, and rose-tinted jasper for Brida's capacity for love, the ritual binding stones of legend, spoken of in their grandmother's most secret teachings. The Trinity stones, Brida breathed. Grandmother said they appeared only when 3 souls were meant to be bound together by something stronger than blood, deeper than time. Aldrich's eyes met theirs across the small space that separated them, and in his ancient gaze they saw not deception, but desperate hope warring with protective love. I won't let you make this sacrifice, he said quietly. Whatever the cost to myself, I won't see you damned for my redemption. The choice isn't yours alone to make, Aelwyn replied, her voice gaining strength as understanding dawned. It never was. This has always been about all 3 of us, our hearts, our futures, our willingness to trust in something larger than our individual fears. Father Marcus watched their exchange with growing irritation, the crown fragment in his hands pulsing with agitated energy. "You have 1 minute to decide," he called out. "Surrender the vampire or face the consequences of harboring a creature of ultimate darkness." But the sisters were no longer listening to his threats. Their attention had turned inward to the deep conversation that flowed between souls who had found in each other something worth any sacrifice. They spoke without words now, in the language of glances and touches and shared understanding that transcended mere mortality. "If we do this," Brida said softly, reaching for the rose jasper stone, "if we activate the binding ritual, there's no certainty about what will happen. The stones might break his curse without damning us, or they might create something entirely new, a bond that transforms all three of us into something unprecedented. Or they might fail entirely," Aldrich added grimly, "leaving us all at the mercy of church authority and divine judgment." Aelwyn picked up the clear quartz stone, feeling its power pulse against her palm like a sight aim. Second heartbeat. "Do you know what I realized while listening to Father Marcus gloat about his clever trap?" she asked. "He assumes that love makes us weak, that caring for someone gives others power over us. But he's wrong." She moved to stand beside her sister, both of them facing Aldrich with expressions of calm determination. "Love doesn't make us vulnerable, it makes us invincible. When we truly care for someone, we discover strength we never knew we possessed. Courage that surprises even ourselves. The priest thinks he's manipulated us into a position where we have to choose between self-preservation and sacrifice," Brida continued. "But that's not the choice at all. The real choice is between living safely and living completely, between protecting ourselves from pain and opening ourselves to the full experience of love." Aldrich stared at them in wonder, recognizing in their words an echo of the wisdom he had lost somewhere in his centuries of solitary existence. "You're saying that the curse was never the real prison," he said slowly. "The real prison was the fear of connection, the terror of being truly known by another soul." "Exactly." Aelwyn smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was a smile free of shadow or uncertainty. "We've spent 30 years in exile, afraid of what people might think if they truly knew us. You've spent 6 centuries avoiding deep connection because you knew it would eventually bring pain. But perhaps the point isn't to avoid the pain, perhaps the point is to embrace the joy, despite knowing that everything ends." The Trinity stones began to resonate more powerfully as the three of them drew closer. Together, their individual energies beginning to harmonize, like voices in a celestial choir. Outside, Father Marcus was shouting something about final warnings and divine retribution, but his words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the growing wall of power that surrounded the cottage. "If we do this," Aldrich said, his voice rough with emotion, "if we bind our souls together with ritual magic, we'll be creating something the world has never seen. Not vampire, not mortal, but something new, 3 hearts, sharing one destiny, 3 spirits woven together by choice rather than curse." "Will you stay if we undress?" Brida asked suddenly, the question that had started everything between them, taking on new meaning in this moment of ultimate decision. "Will you remain with us if we strip away all pretense, all protection, all the careful masks we've worn to survive in a world that fears what it doesn't understand? Will you trust us enough to be completely vulnerable?" Aelwyn added. "Will you believe that love freely given is strong enough to transform even the darkest magic into something beautiful?" Aldrich reached for the obsidian stone, his fingers closing around its smooth surface with the reverence of a man accepting communion. "Yes," he said simply, "to all of it, yes." The moment their hands touched the stones simultaneously, the cottage filled with light. Not the harsh glare of divine judgment, but the warm, golden radiance of sunrise after the longest night. The healing crystals sang in triumphant harmony. their music joined by the deeper, more complex song of the Trinity Stones as ancient magic began to weave itself around the three figures at its center. Through the brilliant illumination, they could see Father Marcus stumbling backward, the crown fragment in his hands beginning to crack as its malevolent power met the overwhelming force of freely given love. His soldiers were shouting and drawing weapons, but their movements seemed sluggish, as if they were moving through honey rather than air. "The ritual," Brida gasped, feeling power flow through her like liquid fire. "It's beginning whether we complete the formal ceremony or not. The stones are responding to our choice, our commitment to each other." "Then we finish what we started," Aelwyn declared, her voice carrying new strength and authority. "We bind ourselves together willingly, completely, and let the consequences fall where they may." As one, they raised the Trinity Stones above their heads, speaking words that came not from memory, but from the deepest wells of their hearts. Words of love and acceptance, of trust and transformation, of three souls choosing to become something greater than the sum of their individual parts. The cottage shook with the force of their combined will, and cracks began to appear in the crown fragment as centuries of accumulated curse energy met the pure intention of hearts that had chosen love over safety. Father Marcus cried out in rage and fear, but his voice was lost in the growing symphony of power that surrounded the ritual site. "Whatever happens," Aldrich said, his words barely audible above the magical storm building around them, "know that these past days with you have been worth 6 centuries of searching. Whatever happens," the sisters replied in unison, their voices blending with his as perfectly as their spirits were beginning to merge. "We choose this. We choose you. We choose us." The Trinity Stones blazed with final, overwhelming brilliance, and in that moment of complete transformation, the old world ended and something entirely new began. The mirror materialized from nothingness, rising from the cottage floor like a silver moon breaking through storm clouds. Its surface rippled with otherworldly light, showing not reflections but truths, the deepest, most honest versions of themselves, stripped bare of every pretense and protection. As the ritual reached its crescendo, the mirror of true selves demanded that all 3 participants face exactly who they were beneath the masks they had worn for so long. Aelwyn saw herself first, and the sight nearly broke her heart. Instead of the competent healer she had always tried to project, the mirror showed a woman consumed by fear of prasadast, inadequacy. Someone who had spent 30 years believing herself unworthy of love because others had named her different, strange, dangerous. In the silvered depths, she watched her true self cower and diminish, always serving others while never daring to ask for anything in return. "I'm not enough," she whispered, the words torn from her soul like splinters. "I never was. Look at me, broken, scarred, afraid. What could I possibly offer someone like you? What good could come from loving someone so flawed?" But even as she spoke, Brida's hand found hers, warm and steady and absolutely certain. "You're wrong," her sister said firmly. "What I see in that mirror is the woman who saved my life 1,000 times over, the healer who never turned away from suffering, even when it meant facing her own pain. The sister who chose exile rather than betray those she loved." The mirror's surface shifted, and Brida's reflection appeared, but not the gentle, accepting woman she had always seemed to be. Instead, the true image showed someone paralyzed by terror of abandonment, someone who had spent her entire life trying to be whatever others needed because she couldn't bear the thought of being alone. Her true self was a creature of desperate attachment, clinging to relationships out of fear rather than love. "I'm selfish," Brida confessed, her voice breaking as she faced her deepest shame. "I don't love, I possess. I don't give, I take. I stayed with you not out of loyalty, but out of cowardice, because I was too afraid to face the world alone. And now I'm doing the same thing with Aldrich, trying to bind him to us, not from love, but from terror of being abandoned again." Aldrich's reflection gazed back at her from the mirror, and his eyes held nothing but compassion. "If that were true," he said gently, "would you have insisted I had the right to refuse this binding? Would you have been willing to face Father Marcus's threats to protect my freedom to choose? Fear doesn't make you selfish, it makes you human." Then the mirror claimed Aldrich himself, and what it revealed was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. Not a monster, not a predator, but a man so convinced of his own unworthiness that he had spent centuries denying himself every chance at happiness. His true reflection showed someone who believed that his very existence was a contamination, that anyone who loved him would be diminished by the association. "I don't deserve redemption," he said, his voice hollow with 6 centuries of self-hatred. "Look what I am, a creature that feeds on life, that brings death wherever it goes. I've told myself this quest was about breaking a curse, but the truth is darker. I want to be free, not to make amends for my sins, but to escape the consequences of them. I'm not seeking redemption, I'm seeking to abandon responsibility." The cottage walls shook as Father Marcus's soldiers began their assault, but inside the ritual circle, time seemed suspended in amber. The mirror of true selves held them captive in honesty's embrace, demanding that they see themselves clearly before they could move forward together. "You're all wrong," Aelwyn said suddenly, her voice cutting through the despair like sunlight through shadow. "Every single one of us is looking at this backwards." She reached out to touch the mirror's surface, and where her fingers made contact, the reflections began to change. "The mirror isn't showing us our flaws to destroy us, it's showing us our wounds so we can heal them together." As if responding to her words, the mirror began to reveal different images, not their broken, fearful selves, but the people they could become when loved completely. Aelwyn saw herself confident and radiant, her healing gifts enhanced by the knowledge that she was valued for exactly who she was. Brida appeared strong and secure, her capacity for love freed from the prison of fear that had distorted it. And Aldrich looked like a man reborn, his immortal strength tempered by mortal compassion, his ancient wisdom guided by renewed hope. This is why the ritual requires a willing heart, Brida realized, understanding flooding through her like dawn. Not because love makes us weak, but because it makes us brave enough to face our deepest truths and choose to transform them. "We don't have to be perfect to love each other," Aldrich added, wonder growing in his voice. "We just have to be honest about our imperfections and trust that love is strong enough to help us grow beyond them." The mirror of true selves blazed with brilliant light as all 3 of them reached toward it, simultaneously no longer seeing obstacles but possibilities, no longer focused on their individual fears but on their shared strength. The first phase of the transformation was complete. They had faced themselves honestly and chosen love anyway. But outside, Father Marcus was screaming orders, and the cottage door was beginning to splinter under the assault of his soldiers. The phoenix feather materialized at the moment of their greatest need, drifting down from the cottage rafters like a blessing made manifest. It glowed with inner fire as it settled between them, a perfect plume of gold and crimson that pulsed with the rhythm of rebirth itself. The moment it touched the ground, the very air around them shimmered with transformative energy, and they understood with perfect clarity that this was the final key to their metamorphosis. "The symbol of renewal," Brida whispered, her eyes wide with recognition. Grandmother spoke of it in her oldest stories, the feather that appears when souls are ready to be reborn into something greater than they were. The cottage door finally gave way with a crash that shook dust from the rafters. Father Marcus stormed through the breach, the cracked crown fragment blazing in his hands, his face twisted with righteous fury. Behind him, his soldiers spread out to surround the ritual circle, but they stopped short as they encountered the wall of power that now surrounded the three figures at its center. "Cease this unholy ceremony," the priest commanded, raising the crown fragment like a weapon. "In the name of all that is sacred, I command you to stop." But his words had no power here. The Trinity stones pulsed with unified energy, the healing crystals sang their harmonious song, and the phoenix feather wove ribbons of transformative fire through the air around them. The ritual had passed beyond the point where mortal authority could intervene. As the transformation reached its peak, something unprecedented began to happen. The sisters felt Aldrich's immortal strength flowing into them, but instead of the terrible hunger that should have accompanied it, they experienced only a profound sense of completion. His darkness was tempered by their light, his ancient pain soothed by their healing gifts. "I can feel it," Aelwyn gasped, her body beginning to glow with the same ethereal radiance that surrounded the healing crystals. "The curse isn't transferring, it's dissolving. Our love is unmaking it entirely." Aldrich cried out, as 6 centuries of accumulated anguish began to lift from his soul like chains made of shadow breaking apart in sunlight. But more than that, he felt the sisters' mortality flowing into him, not to make him weak, but to give him back the capacity for growth, for change, for the kind of love that deepened rather than diminished with time. "It's impossible," Father Marcus snarled, the crown fragment cracking further in his grip. "The curse cannot be broken without payment. Someone must bear the price of his damnation." "Someone is," Brida replied, her voice carrying new harmonics as the transformation reached its crescendo. "All of us are. We're choosing to share not just the burden, but the healing. We're choosing to become something the world has never seen." The phoenix feather rose from the earth, ground, spinning between them in a spiral of fire and light that wrapped around all three like a cocoon of pure possibility. And in that moment of ultimate transformation, they felt their individual selves dissolving and reforming into something greater. Not 3 separate beings bound by magic, but one soul expressed in 3 forms. Aldrich felt his immortality transform from curse to gift, no longer trapped in unchanging existence, but granted the time needed to grow and learn and love across centuries of shared experience. The sisters felt their healing gifts magnified beyond anything their grandmother could have imagined, able not just to mend bodies, but to restore hope, not just to cure disease, but to transform the very nature of suffering itself. "What are you becoming?" Father Marcus demanded, but his voice carried more fear than authority now. "What we were always meant to be," Aelwyn answered, her words echoing with the certainty of prophecy fulfilled. 3 hearts that chose love over fear, trust over safety, transformation over stagnation. The crown fragment finally shattered completely, its malevolent energy unable to survive in the presence of such pure intention. The pieces turned to dust and blew away on a wind that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carrying with them the last remnants of an ancient curse that had been unmade by the simple, revolutionary act of souls choosing to trust each other completely. Father Marcus staggered backward, his weapon destroyed, his authority rendered meaningless by forces beyond his understanding. His soldiers lowered their weapons, overwhelmed by the beauty of what they were witnessing, not dark magic or unholy transformation, but something that spoke to the deepest longing in every human heart. "It's finished," Aldrich said, and his voice carried the wonder of someone who had finally found home after centuries of wandering. He looked at his hands and saw that they still appeared mortal, but felt the immortal strength flowing beneath his skin, controlled now, tempered by love, transformed from hunger into healing. "No," Brida corrected gently, taking his hand as the phoenix feather settled into her palm like a blessing accepted. "It's not finished. It's beginning." The cottage filled with warm, golden light as their transformation completed itself. And when the radiance faded, 3 figures stood where the ritual circle had been changed, but still themselves, immortal but still capable of growth, bound together by choice in a love that would endure across whatever centuries lay ahead. Outside, Father Marcus gathered the scattered remains of his authority and retreated with his soldiers, knowing that he had witnessed something beyond his power to judge or destroy. 6 months later, the cottage garden bloomed with impossible beauty. Where once there had been only the careful cultivation of mortal herbs, now there grew plants that seemed touched by starlight healing, flowers that glowed softly in the twilight, fruit trees that bore blossoms and harvests simultaneously, vegetables that carried within their flesh the power to mend not just bodies, but spirits. The new herb garden had become something beyond the sisters' wildest dreams, a living testament to what could flourish when love was allowed to transform rather than simply sustain. Aelwyn knelt among the luminescent calendula, her hands no longer showing the wear of 57 years, but instead carrying the timeless grace of someone whose age had become fluid, responsive to the rhythm of seasons rather than the relentless march of mortal time. Her healing gift had deepened beyond recognition. Where once she could ease pain and promote recovery, now she could draw sickness from the soul itself, could mend heartbreak as easily as broken bones. "The travellers from Millhaven will arrive before sunset," she said to her companions, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had found Devore, her true purpose. The young mother with the withering sickness, and the old soldier whose memories of war have stolen his sleep. Brida looked up from where she sat, braiding dried lavender with flowers that had never grown in mortal soil. The work had become meditation for her, a way of weaving healing intentions into every strand. Her own transformation had been equally profound. The fear of abandonment that had haunted her for decades had been replaced by an unshakable certainty of connection that extended far beyond their little sanctuary. "The cottage is ready," she replied. "I've prepared beds in the healing room, and the crystals have been singing all morning. They know what's needed." Aldrich emerged from the cottage, carrying fresh linens that bore the subtle glow of fabric, woven with intention as much as thread. His appearance remained that of a man in his prime, but his bearing now carried the wisdom of someone who had learned to balance immortal knowledge with mortal compassion. The terrible hunger that had driven him for centuries had been replaced by a different kind of sustenance, the nourishment that came from healing rather than taking, from giving life rather than consuming it. "Word is spreading," he said, settling beside them in the garden where evening primrose was beginning to open its petals to catch the last light. "Not just about our healing gifts, but about what we represent. 3 souls who chose transformation over safety, who proved that love can rewrite even the oldest curses." It was true. In the months since their transformation, their cottage had become a beacon for those who sought not just physical healing, but hope itself. They came from villages and cities, the sick and the broken, the lonely and the lost. Some came seeking cures for ailments that mortal medicine couldn't touch. Others came simply to witness proof that love could indeed conquer forces that seemed insurmountable. The village of Thornwick had been among the first to change its attitude. When their own children began falling sick with a fever that resisted all conventional treatment, desperation had overcome superstition. A delegation had arrived at the cottage door, led by the same baker's wife who had once whispered accusations of witchcraft, now begging for help, with tears streaming down her face. The sisters had welcomed them without recrimination, had healed their children with gentle hands and kinder hearts, had sent them home with remedies and the revolutionary understanding that wisdom and strangeness were not the same thing as evil. Word had spread from there, like ripples in still water, carrying news of healers who asked nothing more than open hearts and honest gratitude. "Do you ever wonder what our lives might have been if we had never met?" Brida asked, her question directed to both of her companions, but carrying no weight of regret. "Often," Aldrich admitted, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. "I imagine, myself still wandering the world alone, searching for something I could never quite name. Still hungry, still haunted, still convinced that redemption was a gift meant for others. "I think about Thomas sometimes," Aelwyn said softly, touching the moonstone pendant that now glowed with its own inner light. "Wonder if he ever found happiness, if he understood that our parting was never his failure. But I can't regret the path that led us here, to this moment, to this love that none of us could have imagined." The evening star appeared in the deepening sky, and as if summoned by its light, the first of their expected visitors appeared on the path to their cottage. A young woman carrying a bundle that could only be a sick child, her face drawn with worry but brightened by hope. Behind her walked an older man, whose bearing spoke of battles fought and won at terrible cost, seeking peace for wounds that went deeper than flesh. "Shall we?" Aldrich asked, rising to welcome their guests. "Together," the sisters replied in unison, the word carrying all the weight of promise and possibility that had brought them to this moment. As they approached their cottage door, now reinforced not with iron and wood but with love made manifest, Aelwyn thought about the question that had started everything between them: "Will you stay if we undress?" It had meant something different then, a plea for acceptance despite vulnerability, a desperate hope that someone might love them despite their scars and fears. Now she understood that the question itself had been backwards. The real miracle wasn't that someone might stay after seeing their flaws, but that they had all found the courage to reveal themselves completely, to trust that love was strong enough to transform weakness into strength, fear into wisdom, solitude into connection. The new herb garden rustled softly in the evening breeze, its magical plants whispering songs of growth and renewal. Inside the cottage, healing crystals hummed with anticipation, and somewhere in the distance, the bells of Thornwick chimed the hour of vespers, not with the voice of judgment, but with the sound of welcome for all who sought sanctuary. Their story continued, but the beginning was perfect.